shaft is arguably the most important component of a golf club. And there are several features of the shaft and terms that describe those features that I think are worthy of a little chat in the pub. Shafts in golf clubs from the very beginning of golf in the 14th century were applewood, maybe hawthorn, and eventually hickory, an American material that was found to have many virtues of value. And that was the shaft material for decades, if not many centuries. And it was only replaced in the early part of the 20th century, about 1930-ish, by steel. And then steel took over because it was stronger and had less unpredictability and more resistance to torque. And that is one of the terms that I want to mention here. Hickory was made one at a time and shaped to flex in the way that the individual found most beneficial. In fact, the man that I did my apprenticeship with did his apprenticeship at the same course with the preceding head professional, who sat out in front of the golf shop there and used a broken piece of bottle, a piece of glass with a sharp corner, to shave the shafts until the flex was the one that was thought to be effective. So they were very individual and they had a lot of torque, and torque is the term given to the ability of the shaft not just to flex like a bow, but to actually twist around its axis. And as you can see, I don't have any great difficulty in twisting my left hand several degrees in the other direction of my right hand. That's the torque that we're talking about. And it, of course, obliged the players to develop swings that actually accounted for that. They had to time the downswing and position it and apply force in such a way that the shaft was flexed and then would unflex at the right time. So torque probably was over 4 degrees with these wooden shafts. Now that doesn't sound a lot, but as you saw with my little demonstration there, it was quite a fair amount. And then they were able, with steel, to reduce that torque by a substantial amount. Now, the replacement of steel, they experimented a little with aluminium at one point, but steel was really the major material all the way up until the 80s. And then they started to experiment with graphite. Graphite, stronger than steel, lighter than steel, and they found ways to weave it into a fabric that could be then layered and fixed with epoxy so that it was a very rigid and strong material. They had the benefit of the extra lightness, and a steel shaft, the type that I grew up using, would weigh 130 grams. And they worked very hard to get it down to something near 100, but that was about the limit. So they were heavy, they were torque resistant, and they also had quite predictable flex characteristics. And so I'll get to that in a moment. But back to the idea of the graphite. They were able to make graphite shafts that were lighter, but still, unfortunately, vulnerable to the torque and not that predictable. And so it took quite a few years before the graphite got to the point that we find ourselves at now, where its resistance to torque is adequate, its consistency from one shaft to the next is adequate, and therefore the benefit of the lightness is actually achievable. So with regard to the flex, if you look at a steel shaft, it's less visible, well, invisible with a graphite shaft, but with a steel shaft there were steps, and the step pattern was a proprietary thing with people like True Temper and the other major manufacturers of steel. And they found that by stepping it in a predictable way, they could affect the flex of the shaft. Well, what would change? The better golfers always preferred a higher, and here's a new term, kick point, where the flex of the club would actually be higher up, nearer the hands, because the feel of the shaft was then enhanced. You could feel the shot better. Now, for most golfers, the benefit of having the kick point lower down in this area was that it would help launch the ball. Now, with the old wooden-headed clubs, we used to actually put a lead or brass weight in the trailing edge of the back of the club in a place that was hopefully strong enough to not have it break free, and that would apply force during the swing down in this direction. That would apply force that would actually force the club to bend in this direction and add lift to the shot. And so that kick point, if it was lower for the kind of lift and power that it offered, then it would actually be enhanced by that weight distribution. And that's what we're seeing now with the clubs being developed that are hollow. Hollow golf clubs, I think, a bane to golf because it's changed the game so enormously. It started with the Big Bertha in, I think, 1980, and it's now ubiquitous in golf. It allowed the advantage of that lighter shaft that they were able to develop with the graphite to be fully taken advantage of, because in the beginning with graphite, they thought, well, it's lighter, that's wonderful, we can make the head heavier. But they were stuck with the old sized heads. They were quite small. And so they got some benefit, but not enormous amounts. Then they found out that they could actually make bigger heads that were still strong enough to resist the impact with the ball. Early on, the hollow clubs would just cave in the hands of a good golfer. But they made them stronger, and that meant they could make them bigger. Bigger meant they could make the shaft longer, and drivers are often now 3 inches longer than they were when I did my apprenticeship and after. 43 inches used to be quite normal for a male golfer, and now they're 45, 46. So the problem with the graphite was that if you made it longer, the head of the club, which was already quite small, would look like a pea on the end of a stick. It was virtually impossible to imagine getting that on a golf ball. So the bigger head allowed us to take advantage of that longer shaft, and therefore we got the maximum club head speed. It also allowed for, and the rules have tried to control this, a sort of trampolining of the face, which would add power, and also distribution of the weight of the club around the perimeter, which would then make it less vulnerable to an off-center hit. Now, I talked about bulge and roll in a recent video. If you catch a ball on the toe of the club, it will put a gear effect hook onto the ball, and the opposite is true in the neck. Well, they're now able to engineer clubs that are not going to curve as much when you hit off center. And so they've made the game quite a bit easier with these $400 and $500 and $600 drivers. But I regret it because I think that it's changed the game in a way that isn't particularly beneficial, certainly makes some of the greatest courses in the world redundant. And so if I were consulted, I would say go back to a solid head. I don't care what you make it of, but make it solid, because that would force them to go back to a size that I think makes the game more challenging and will inevitably reduce the length of the club and the distance they're hitting. But that's just me. So we've got torque, we've got flex, we've got kick point. And in terms of the flex, it usually falls into a few categories. We've got the ladies' shafts for swings that are 65 miles an hour, that kind of thing, 70 miles an hour at the most. Then we have what we used to call an A shaft, which is the a light shaft, and that's for seniors. And then we've got the men's regular, which is usually thought to be appropriate for somebody swinging at about 90 miles an hour and maybe a little higher. And then once you get up near 100 miles an hour, you go for stiff. And of course, then the champions go extra stiff and crazy stuff. So that's the flex choice. And then, of course, we've got the different kinds of weight in the shaft, because they're actually able now to make graphite shafts that are less than 50 grams, quite remarkable. That's only, well, it's less than 2 ounces. And so those are some of the features about shafts that you'll hear talked about.